Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Margaret Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, protests continue to be held throughout the world denouncing the Israeli genocide in Gaza. On Saturday, Europeans made their voices heard as they took to the streets in many cities from Vienna, Madrid, Rome to London. Berlin and The Hague all have witnessed massive demonstrations in solidarity with the Palestinian people and calling for an end to the Israeli genocide. Other parts of the world also continue to have demonstrations, such as the United States, South America. People are calling for a ceasefire now, and they say no to a ground attack on Rafah. But as they make their voices heard, the Holocaust continues so far, leaving over 30,300 people slaughtered, most of them women and children. When will the world say enough is enough? I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. Out of New York, Margaret Kimberley, co-founder of Black Agenda Report. And out of Ossining, New York, DeBar, activist and commentator. Well, thank you both for being with me. Nice to see you. Starting it off with Margaret. Margaret, when you see these demonstrations continuing, despite that it has been many months now, I mean, what does that say to you? What exactly does it mean?
Well, it tells us that the world is with Palestine. Regardless of what governments do, regardless of what the U.S. says, the EU says, any of their allies and puppet states, the people of the world are with Palestine. It's very clear. There is revulsion around the world at the site of the war crimes, of the genocides. And I remind your viewers, war crimes are defined. Genocide is defined. Israel's a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. And it's very clear there is intentional harm to a group of people. There is collective punishment. So people know this now. And we have to ask ourselves why, despite the fact that people want an end to the killing, most Americans want a ceasefire. Despite their differences in opinion about U.S.-Israel policy, Americans want a ceasefire, but that is the last thing they will get. And that has to be our question about supposed so-called democracies that don't do what the people want.
Well, Don, it is important to note that many protesters have had to pay a price for their anti-Zionist stance. Let's discuss some of the obstacles that have been placed on pro-Palestine demonstrators, from losing their jobs, demonized, arrested, blocked social media, etc. I mean, your thoughts on this overall?
Well, it's more extensive than that also. Start, for example, with some of the laws that have been put into place over the last 3-4 years, or more or less, in places like New York State, where if you're a state employee, if you called for boycott, the BDS program, you can lose your employment and your pension and everything else. These are pretty unique, really, pieces of legislation and restraints on speech in this country historically. As bad as things have been from time to time and altogether over time, the fact that you can't even broach the subject of divesting or sanctioning Israel in a public or even a semi-public forum without losing your employment, that this is, I won't say unprecedented, but again, unique. The condition that is giving rise to this, obviously, is that the most horrific crime in the history of humanity that's been televised is being televised right now. This, given the extent of media coverage and the saturation of the audience, which is global at this point, it even makes the coverage of the Vietnam War in the 1960s pale by comparison. That went on for well, if you want to, how far back you want to go, but the TV coverage here went on from maybe 1962, 1963 until the war was finally ended in early 70s. every night people got a body count like as if they were watching a football game or whatever. But now we're seeing coverage across the board from people on the ground, no mediation for a lot of it, and people are getting a real sense of what this actually is. And they get to see, when they see what it actually is, the huge vector between what actually is and what the people that are supposedly their leaders are telling them is going on, and the way that the media that they've been following for most of their lifetimes has been portraying it. And it's creating a real contradiction, I think, in people's, minds. A cognitive dissonance that's been kind of unprecedented socially, that's giving rise to these things in a condition, by the way, where people are still suffering massively economically and in almost every other area of their lives. So there's some real revolutionary potential here, and we're even starting to see some of that bleed into reality.
Well, what about that, Margaret? Don talked about the cognitive dissonance. When we look at the situation and the growing schism between the people and the governments, and what the people want and what the governments deliver, let's talk about possibilities, because Don said this can be a real revolutionary moment. Do you think that they're making that connection, that this is really, it is, of course, the main situation at hand is the genocide in Gaza, but the other part of that is their governments and actually becoming aware of really what their governments stand for?
Well, people know what their governments stand for, but we are told in the U.S. that we don't have any options except to vote, and to vote for the main party candidates for the duopoly. Donald Trump has not made clear what he would do differently, if he would do anything differently than Biden. He was a strong supporter of Israel when he was president before, so we can only assume he would do the same thing. But this is a moment, and it's not just Israel. This is emblematic of the political system as a whole, that it does not do what the people want. And people are demonized, terrorized into thinking they don't have any options except to vote, and to vote for the people who continually do what they don't want to have done. I think you're going to see an increase in voting for smaller party candidates. And I hope you see actually fewer people participating at all. And I hope that we see Americans starting to ask themselves about the political system, about whether or not it really is a democracy, about whether or not their only choice is to vote, and to vote for these two parties that have no legitimacy with millions of people.
Well, Don, how likely is it to see even more action by Americans? How about April 15th is coming up? How about not paying their taxes? Because as they become more and more aware of what their tax dollars are going for, wouldn't that be a great possibility or a likely conclusion?
It's not a battlefield to choose to fight this war on, although it might be sort of a ancillary site. First of all, most people pay their taxes most people that are working or that have an income stream pay their taxes as they make the income. So that money is already in the hands of the government. The documentation they have to file by April 15th is to reclaim their share of it in the event that it was overtaken and overpaid, or to make up for a deficiency. Then, even if it were effective, however, the power that's granted to the Internal Revenue Service, in other words, to the collection arm of the U.S. government, is so vast and so extensive that the moment their computer tells them that you didn't pay your share, they can go on a hunt and seize your property, put a lien against your house, clean out your bank account, whatever, with really very little opportunity to fight. So this is an area where all you're going to do is lose, basically. And because of the way the media is set up, you're not going to really have an opportunity for anyone to even know that you did it. People are just going to wonder how you ended up on the street. But this does raise a question to me, because we're seeing people in the streets now, all over the world about Gaza. They're in the streets, for example, in Europe over other things, and I'd like to get to that later. But You know, we did this with Iraq. It's very good to see people mobilize, first of all, because it says, A, they're aware of what's going on, B, they have a serious enough problem with it to go off their behinds and out of their lives and come into the streets and try to do something about it. But we've seen also it's not terribly effective if it's effective at all. And if it is effective, it's effective on a very long, slow curve. And when you have a genocide going on, the people at the other end of the genocide don't really have that much time. You know, we can settle the question of whether this was wrong or not well after the time that it's done. And it doesn't do much good to the people who are being killed. And it doesn't even do much as an example to make sure that never again is really never again this time. We have to start formulating some things that we can do to stop things now. And I think that's where a lot of our thinking and a lot of our work has to be placed at the moment, to figure out things that are effective in a much more immediate sense, and start trying them out and seeing what works.
Okay, I'm going to get back to you on that. But Margaret, it's not just Europe, of course, but other parts of the world that are denouncing the Israeli genocide, also places like Caracas and Havana. Do you think we're on the verge of a global transition and increased solidarity against not only the Israeli regime, but also its supporters?
Oh, I definitely think so. That's definitely the case. The problem, as Don DeBar pointed out, is that the people who fled to Rafah for protection and who are now being killed by Israel don't have that kind of time. There is a change in the world. The unipolar world where the U.S. Felt it could control the whole planet for the past 30 years is clearly over. But we don't see, as of yet, a formation that is willing to take action to stop this. And I think we have to talk about other countries too and what they do and don't do. How many countries have ended diplomatic relations with Israel? How many of them are trying to send supplies to the people in Gaza? There are Arab governments, Egypt, which is going along with this ethnic cleansing plan. It's a U.S. puppet state, and I think we need to protest them too. There was an oil embargo 50 years ago in the 70s by the oil-producing states in the region. We don't see any talk of that now.
Right.
So while these political formations are changing, it's not changing fast enough to help the people of Gaza.
Well, Don, in Washington, D.C., protests and sit-ins continue in front of the Zionist embassy, where American Airman Aaron Bushnell lit himself afire in protest of the Israeli genocide. Do you think that after his death, more Americans are becoming more aware of their responsibility in general for this genocide, their tax dollars? After Bushnell wrote, quote, "What would I do if my country was committing genocide? You are doing it right now." Okay, I don't have your voice, Don. Unfortunately, I cannot hear you.
Very good question. Back in 1963, there were a couple of Buddhist monks that lit themselves on fire in protest of the U.S. war in Vietnam. And then in 1965, Norman Morrison lit himself on fire outside the Pentagon in the full view of then Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. And McNamara has spoken subsequently about the impact that had on him. But that war didn't end for another 8 years. Now, Aaron Bushnell was standing outside of the Israeli embassy. And let's say it's him with whatever the device is, but we'll call it a Molotov cocktail or something filled with an accelerant that you light a match and hit the target. There's two potential targets there while he's standing there, and I'm not advocating hitting either one of them. But the reality is he could have either turned that on himself, as he did, and that's one set of outcomes that come with it, and or he could have thrown it at the embassy, and that's another one. And then the question would be, one, what is the following, what follows from what he actually did? And then also, what would follow if he had turned it the other way? What would the reaction, what would the response be? And I think all of the things that we're looking at right now we have to look at in that context. What is going to follow from doing this? What do we have as historical precedent? And how does that play against the timeline of trying to save these people from being, extinct?
Yeah. Well, Margaret, let's look at the world in general. Do you feel that the world is becoming more aware of who the real axis of evil is and who the real axis of resistance is and the importance of this?
Oh, yes. I think people around the world know that the people we're always told we shouldn't like, the people we're supposed to hate as being terrorists, we're supposed to hate as being evil, are not. It's the people directing us, propagandizing us. That's the axis of evil, and people know it. That's why you see millions of people around the world protesting. Here in New York yesterday, it was a pouring rain, and still thousands of people came out. So people know. The question is, what are they going to do? Aaron Bushnell, his act was one of frustration, of the powerlessness that people feel. I think people need to have more of a revolutionary mindset and think about other things they can do rather than destroying themselves in hopes of changing policy. He's the second person to self-immolate. Someone did in Atlanta who apparently survived, but that person was disappeared. Their name has never been given, their age, their gender, nothing. And we're told the law enforcement and the media covered it up completely. So Aaron Bushnell is actually the second person to do this. But that degree of frustration is not what we want to see. We want to see action, and if nothing else, we have to start out with the question of what we do differently.
And let's start from there, Don, because you already talked about the protests. How effective are they? At the end of the day, we saw a lot of protests in 2003 and run up before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and that didn't change anything. So what's next? What should be done in your perspective?
I think we're going to see some examples of what can be done taking shape, particularly in Europe. It's not written about much here. They'll talk about farmers' protests in the same way that they did about the truckers, basically, that is some kind of anti-immigrant response and racist, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, what's happening in Europe right now is that the large capital formations in the West, Vanguard, et cetera, have taken over the bulk of the usable farmland in Ukraine on the cheap under the conditions that have existed there for the last 4 or 5 years. And they're starting to dump crops into the European market at the same time that there's like a 1-2 punch being delivered to the farmers over the so-called global warming concerns. And so having endured 40 or 50 years already of all kinds of austerity and rollbacks in various public subsidies, et cetera, people's backs are to the wall who never expected they would get there. This like the middle class of Europe that is now forced into the trenches with the workers, and those who are even worse off than the workers have been rendered. We're seeing an expression of anger and frustration in the context of an understanding that the institutions are no longer legitimate. And that is now happening where even the moral face of the parties in water are being exposed as genociders in front of the whole world. So I think the kind of response we're watching form in Europe is going to include some technologies for revolutionary activity that we haven't seen before, that we might look to and study and perhaps adapt to our own conditions if they're appropriate. I have spent a little time now on 2 separate trips with the Yellow Vests in Paris, for example, and heard conversations that they have about, they've been trying to maintain, a basic organizational presence on the streets of Paris since the first time I was there was in 2018. And as these things flare up, there are different groups, Communist Party, Socialist Party, et cetera, that have an infrastructure that people can latch onto. Again, I think we're going to start seeing like a maturing of revolutionary technology on the streets of Europe that we can look to maybe for some advice.
Okay. What about the streets of the United States, Margaret? Your thoughts?
Well, I believe that these protests are going to continue, and they're going to intensify. But the question remains, what else people will turn to? Will it be self-destruction, like in the case of Aaron Bushnell, or will it be under some sort of revolutionary action? And that can mean a variety of things. But I think what is clear is that the system has no legitimacy for millions of people. There are cracks even among the ruling class. Don mentioned funding Ukraine. There's a disagreement about whether to continue it. This had been a bipartisan policy, and now some Republicans want to stop that funding, although the same hasn't happened about Israel. So I think, I think people need political education to figure out what steps to take next that would be more effective and take advantage of this moment. This is, there are people who think, that by osmosis there are going to be changes. No, it's the people who have to make the change. The arc of the moral universe does not bend towards justice unless people demand that it does, unless people force it to. So that's the question now. Are the people going to act on their feelings of disenfranchisement, their realization that they don't live in democracies? How are people going to respond on the subject of Israel and others?
Okay. Well, Don, at the bottom line, do you think there's anything that is going to stop this Holocaust besides the resistance itself?
Well, resistance, of course. The question is what kind of resistance focuses on what points, what's effective, and who can sustain what long enough to deal with what's coming from Israel and really from the United States through Israel. It's a war. Israel and the United States, or the United States is at war with the people of Palestine, with the people of that region, pretty much with the whole world, using various agencies in this particular battle, I guess, of Gaza. It's with the Israeli military as a front. But it's the same war that's being fought in Ukraine, and it's the same war that's being fought in a variety of places in Latin America and Asia, whether it's in the brush and Africa. It's the same enemy. It's humanity on one side, and the elite that dominates the structures of Europe, Asia, Japan, South Korea, a few other places on the other. We don't know who's in the castle now. We just know that all of our things are being taken from us and dragged there, and someone's consuming them and coming back and beating hell out of us all the time. You used to be able to go to the castle and drag them out and off with their head, and things were better for a while. We don't know who that is now. We're looking at something that was meant to survive a nuclear war and still function. So we have to figure out how capturing this is the reason I always looked at January 6th as a joke. Capturing the Congress would not capture the U.S. government. Of course not. If Congress were hit with a nuclear weapon, the U.S. government would not fall. It was designed to survive that. That's what the internet is. And so if we're going to organize a revolution against this thing, we got to understand what it is first. And I think if we get busy on that part of it, a lot of things will fall into place.
And on that note, thank you both for being with me on this Spotlight. Margaret Kimberley, co-founder of Black Agenda Report out of New York. Don DeBar, activist and commentator out of Vassar, New York. And thank you, viewers, for being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Margaret Hashemi. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.